This is a download from the BBC.
Welcome to the Forum from the BBC. Hello, I'm Bridget Kendall with a programme today about uncertainty. Are you someone who likes to have everything cut and dried, as clear and certain as possible? Or do you relish the grey areas that make life's choices complex and confusing? Well, today we bring together three people who've thought long and hard about uncertainty in the realms of literature, philosophy and mathematics. From the United States, Jordan Ellenberg is a maths professor in Wisconsin and 3 times winner for the US in the International Mathematical Olympiad. Zambian-born Namwali Serpell is an award-winning writer and literary scholar at Berkeley in California. And with me in the studio is Rupert Reed, who teaches philosophy at the University of East Anglia and puts it to practical use as a political activist for the UK's Green Party. And let's start with you, Jordan Ellenberg, and the world of mathematics, which is often thought of as an abstract realm which obeys a set of clear rules, a very certain world. But in your new book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking, you argue that we shouldn't think of mathematics as a set of cast-iron rules, because, especially in the last 100 years or so, it's become a discipline that deals a lot with uncertainty. Can you briefly chart the change?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I do think there is a cultural stereotype that the mathematician is the person who tells you what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong, what is 1 and what is 0, right? But just as you say, the real world is filled with things that are uncertain, and it's not the mathematician's job to shy away from that and say that it's something that math can't talk about. It's actually even older than this century. I mean, it starts about 400 years ago, which for mathematicians means like yesterday. It's quite new that we started to understand that things that were random, things that were governed by chance, things that we were not sure about. Classically, that was thought of as not part of mathematics, but now the world has completely changed, right? And as you say, the 20th century, right, the rise of quantum physics, and in some sense, like the crisis in the foundations of mathematics, where we started to doubt that mathematics could be fully reduced to pure logic in any interesting way. It's kind of a new landscape, and mathematicians very much embrace the grey areas that you talked about.
Yeah, I was thinking, in physics, there's even Heisenberg's principle is called the uncertainty principle, isn't it? And then there's Einstein's theory of relativity. It all gives you a clue of a world which was changing. But you're saying it changed in mathematics too.
What we now know after the 20th century is that really at the smallest scale, matter and energy and the stuff our world is made of are not deterministic. It's not like billiard balls clanking off each other on a table where if you aim your cue with sufficient precision, you can predict exactly what's going to happen. It would be simple if the bottommost structure of the world were like that, but it's just not. What can we do?
But surely at a fundamental level, when it comes to mathematics, unlike physics, you are dealing with certainties. 2 + 2 does equal 4.
Yes, but you see me hesitate, right? Or you hear me hesitate. Because even that, it was once thought to be completely obvious that the basic structures of mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, could be reduced to pure logic. In some sense, when people like Bertrand Russell actually tried to do it—
20th century philosopher.
Exactly, and mathematician, I would say. But there were real problems, it turned out. And I think nowadays that project of reducing all of mathematics to something that could be insta-checked by machine with sufficient time and sufficient precision, we don't really think of our field that way anymore.
So what's new in the field of mathematics that explores all these uncertainties?
Well, obviously, one big thing is the field of statistics, which in its first forms, it starts around the beginning of the 20th century. But nowadays, in what some people like to call the age of big data, again, not a great name, right? Because it's not so much that it's big, it's that it's rich and has complicated structures. That's what makes it difficult. I think we're at the cusp of a new kind of statistics. We have new problems of inference where you see a certain phenomenon taking place in a complex network, whether that's the brain, whether it's a social network, whether it's the internet, trying to understand what kind of phenomena could be causing the observations we make. It's much, much more complicated than, you give half of a population this drug and half that other one and see who gets better and who dies, right? I mean, that kind of statistics is great, but the problems that we're facing now, it simply doesn't apply, and we're going to have to develop everything anew.
So you're talking about uncertainty in the application of mathematics, that when you apply mathematics to the real world, then you have to be aware that some things are very hard to quantify. But what about inherently in mathematics?
Well, To be honest, I mean, I think all mathematicians, we see the things we study as part of the real world. I don't make a big distinction between a number and a frog. I think those are the same kind of things fundamentally. I think it's well described in what William Carlos Williams said, no ideas but in things, right? We can talk about it in an abstract way, but we always have concrete things in mind.
You cite an early encounter in your book, don't you, about mathematical uncertainty when you got a summer job working for a public health researcher who asked you to predict how many people would have tuberculosis in the year 2050. What happened there? What did you come up with?
After doing a lot of work and a lot of what's called mathematical modeling, I found we really had no idea at that time how many people were going to have tuberculosis in the year 2050, simply because in any complex system like the spread of a disease throughout a population over the course of not a month, not a year, but like many decades, subject to future conditions that we don't even know how to predict in any precise way, you might say that the noise overwhelms the signal very quickly, so that you end up in a situation of complete uncertainty. I mean, I think what we're going to talk about a lot today is that kind of dance between things we sort of know about that are kind of uncertain and kind of not. Here I felt like we were in a situation where, tuberculosis could go extinct or it could become completely endemic. But I think that when somebody hires a mathematician, they often want them to say, well, tell me your best estimate, tell me an answer. I didn't hire you to say I'm not sure. I hired you to give me a number because that's what mathematicians do. But it's not really what mathematicians do, not anymore, if ever. Part of our job is like understanding which questions have a good numerical answer and which don't.
You also warn, don't you, that we should be wary of other sorts of predictions, like the dramatic predictions there are about Western rates of obesity, that they're going to carry on ballooning, because mathematically you have to understand that may not be the case.
Right. Well, in this case, this was a much simpler problem because the model that they used predicted that those obesity rates would go above 100%. So that's hard to see happening. I mean, it was an example of using a mathematical technique without thinking very carefully about whether the answers you were getting made sense. And that's, I think, what we come back to in math. We give people a lot of mathematical technique, right? I mean, there are things built into your Excel spreadsheet that you can do with a button that once would have been like serious undertakings that you would publish a mathematical paper about. Now it's just pushing a button, but it puts a lot of responsibility on the user to know whether it makes sense. If you predict that in a certain year 100% of all Americans will be obese, but only 80% of black males will be obese, that makes no sense.
Let's open this up to my other guests here. Rupert Reed, you look at this from the point of view of philosophy. This trajectory that Jordan's talking about in the 20th century, do you see the same thing in philosophy? This sort of move through the 20th century to embrace uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If we go back to the birth of modern philosophy in the 16th century with René Descartes, Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." And he thought that was something that we could be certain of, and he sought to build on that certainty to an edifice of knowledge, all of which would be certain. Many people came after him and said, well, we don't think you can actually be certain of these things, and therefore we don't know anything, or we don't know the things that you thought we could know, Mr. Descartes. Now, I think what was in error here was the quest for certainty itself. Knowledge, scientific knowledge, for example, is not something that we need to be certain of. We don't require certainty in science. What we require is to know things that we know, things that we understand, the basis for our action. It doesn't need to be certain. And in the 20th century in philosophy, philosophers such as the pragmatists and Ludwig Wittgenstein really pushed forward this idea that the quest for certainty has led us astray.
Wittgenstein, 20th century Austrian-British philosopher. What's the essence of what he says on this?
So Wittgenstein, who was the student of Bertrand Russell, the philosopher mentioned earlier, Wittgenstein basically tried to argue that there were many things we could be certain of, not just one thing, not just that I think, therefore I am, but also that the Earth has existed for more than 5 minutes, in my case, that my name is Rupert Reed, that David Cameron is the Prime Minister. He thought there were lots of things that we could be certain of, but none of them are very interesting. And he thought that it was a mistake to try to build on those things, to get to the things that we actually need to know about. He argued anything that we actually can doubt is something which is not a candidate for certainty. So, again, if we look at scientific knowledge, it's just in a different category from certainty. So Wittgenstein suggests that doubts require grounds, that you can't just doubt anything hyperbolically. So Descartes would say, well, you think that you're sitting here in a radio studio, you think that you're speaking to people all around the world, but it could just be all a dream. Wittgenstein says, that's not how it is, because in order to think that this could be a dream, you would have to have evidence that it was or could be a dream. And any evidence that you could cite would be less certain than your certainty that you are in fact sitting here right now, talking on the radio, talking to people all around the world. So what Wittgenstein suggests is that we need to be clear about the difference between certainty and knowledge, and not try to turn things that we can be certain of into things that we can know, because they're in, roughly speaking, different categories.
Namwali, you deal in the world of literature, but this is also about the world of thought, isn't it? And you suggest that literary modernism has also embraced uncertainty, influenced by the same processes that we're hearing about from Jordan and from Rupert, or different ones?
Literary uncertainty is as old as literature. The very first novels are metafictional and experimental. We can look at Don Quixote, we can look by Miguel Cervantes, we can look at Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, and we can see that literary uncertainty has been around basically since language has been deployed to make literary art. But what I think has happened in the 20th century is that there has been a shift in our understanding of literary uncertainty, why it might be useful or productive, and why the attempt to get rid of ambiguities or to clarify thought through literature might be a kind of fool's errand. I look at the British literary critic William Empson, who was very influenced by Wittgenstein and also by the new physics, the quantum mechanics that Jordan mentioned earlier. He was at Cambridge in the 1920s. He started off as a mathematician and shifted to studying literature. Empson was very interested in the revolution at the turn of the 20th century, the new cosmology of Einstein and Eddington, as he put it. His own poetry invoked astrophysics, biology, chemistry, geometry. And what Empson was very interested in doing is formulating a way of understanding literary uncertainty, of analyzing it, and of seeing what it might produce. His own work is extremely proliferative and full of thoughts and ideas. And he basically changed the way we view uncertainty with his landmark work of literary criticism, 7 Types of Ambiguity, written in 1930.
It's fascinating to hear the three of you. It makes you wonder which discipline feeds off which. Jordan, I wonder what you think, this language of doubt and uncertainty. Does it start with the physicists? Or do you think that what we're hearing about in philosophy as well from Rupert and the language of literature from Namwali, that also plays a role?
Oh, but I don't care so much who gets the credit. I mean, I think at least for somebody like me, when we're trained in math, we're trained very ahistorically. We don't tend to sort of look back to the formations of the ideas. And when I was writing my book and reading about Descartes was one of the people I learned a lot about that I didn't know, and other people developing these ideas, you realize that this kind of separation that we have now is rather artificial and is not historically what was going on. People who were thinking very hard about mathematics were also thinking about literature, were also thinking about philosophy. I actually didn't know Empson was a math student, Namwali.
In his journal, he quotes Wittgenstein, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent," almost a kind of capitulation to uncertainty. And Empson writes, "Could Romeo not be written? Were the songs and sonnets what cannot be said? What philosophy cannot state, art lays open." So he sort of makes the claim that art is going to do better than philosophy when it comes to grappling with things like uncertainty.
Well, we'll hear a bit more about that from you in a moment, Namwali, but let me just focus a bit on philosophy and your thoughts, Rupert Reed, on this, because you apply the notion of uncertainty both to philosophy but also to political action, because besides being an academic, you run a think tank called Greenhouse and you're a keen environmentalist. And you argue that lack of certainty shouldn't be used as an excuse for doing nothing about a problem, particularly when it comes to arguments around the issue of climate change.
Absolutely, yeah. So in relation to man-made dangerous climate change, what some people say is, well, we're not certain that it's happening. The evidence isn't absolutely certain, therefore we shouldn't do anything. But to my mind, this is a complete misunderstanding. As I was saying earlier, scientific knowledge is never quite certain. That's not the kind of thing that it is. And if we wait till we have certain evidence for something, it may well be too late, especially if there's a time delay to that problem getting worse, as there is with dangerous climate change. So the irony here really is this, that if the so-called climate change skeptics are actually serious in saying that they don't trust the evidence and don't trust the modelling, they actually ought to be more precautious, not less precautious. Because, of course, if the scientists, the climate scientists, are wrong, they could be wrong in one of two directions. They could be making out that climate change is worse than it actually is, or they could be making out that climate change is less bad than it actually is. So if you're actually not certain about how bad something is, that's a reason for being more precautious. The precautionary principle, if you're not sure about something and the potential negative consequences of it are very severe, if you face ruin, well, then there are some risks that just aren't worth taking. So we have to remember, in cases where the stakes are that high, that we don't need to know all about the world in order to act. We just need to have a good idea of how to act based on our available knowledge and based on what the potentiality is for things to go wrong. So I say that we need to be guided by the precautionary principle, where the precautionary principle is seek to avoid being reckless, avoid any action that carries with it a possibility of complete ruin, provided that there is an alternative possible course of action that does not carry with it such a risk of ruin.
What do you think about this, Jordan? Do you agree, in an uncertain world, that we should be guided by this precautionary principle?
We should try to avoid being guided by any principles. Principles are very weak, right? I mean, and no single principle is going to do a very good job of telling us what to do. At least that's how it seems to me when I compare the kind of messiness of understanding public policy and understanding politics with the relative ease of understanding mathematical objects. I mean, I'm actually curious, if we're going to talk about mathematicians and philosophers and literary people, what about Pascal and Pascal's wager, right? So Blaise Pascal was one of the guys, he's one of the people who really brings uncertainty into the ambit of, or into the space of things that mathematics can talk about. If we're all going to pick on Wittgenstein, I mean, this statement that what we can't speak about, we must pass over in silence, that's a very unmathematical thing to say. I mean, mathematicians say what we can't speak about, we haven't figured out how to speak about yet.
And at least present the probabilities, even if we can't present the facts.
So Pascal, who was a very devout Christian, took the position, I mean, it's a little more complicated than this, but he took the position that the consequences of failing to adopt Christianity the potential consequences were so grievous that even though he certainly correctly recognized that religious faith was not something you can be certain about in a mathematical sense. He specifically says, reason is silent about God's existence in nature, but he felt that the consequences of disbelief, the potential consequences, the eternal torment, the missing out on eternal joy, were so great that on kind of precautionary grounds, he felt that people should strive to be religious. That, to modern people, seems a bit of a weird justification.
Yeah, I
saw the same. I saw the same analogy actually in between Pascal's wager and what Rupert was saying about the precautionary principle. I also thought, what about the analogy to our fear of terrorism and the way that it dictates certain kind of public policy? When is precaution too far? When does it become merely defensive? How do we weigh the risk of a worse outcome?
The key thing about the precautionary principle, as I said, is when there is an alternative possible course of action that does not carry with it a risk of ruin, then you ought to take that course of action. Then you ought to be precautious. That's when the precautionary principle is relevant. So I think that's an important difference between the case of thinking about terrorism and the case of thinking about, say, dangerous climate change, or another one would be GM crops. It's possible for us to avoid the risks of dangerous climate change if we build down our emissions. It's possible for us to avoid using GM crops, if we use...
This is genetically modified crops.
Genetically modified crops, yes, if we use conventional farming or organic farming, etc. It's not so obvious what the alternative is supposed to be that doesn't carry with it a risk in the case of the terrorism case. But of course I agree that the precautionary principle can be abused, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with Pascal's particular employment of it. But the kind of logic that Pascal uses is, I think, relevant to the situation we're in today with genuine crises. And if we don't throw ourselves into action to seek to avert that crisis, if we say we have to wait till all the evidence is in, it will be too late.
You use one other example, don't you, Rupert? You talk about evidence and smoking and say this is an example where the linking of smoking to cancer wasn't immediately shown. But if we use the precautionary principle, maybe we would have protected ourselves against it a bit earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So the tobacco company said, look, until we've got incontrovertible evidence that smoking causes cancer, we shouldn't take any action about it. And they deliberately evaded employing precautionary reasoning, which would have warned that even in the absence of such evidence, it's still unsafe to pump your lungs full of smoke and chemicals day in, day out in a manner without natural precedent. Now, somebody might respond to this by saying, well, yes, but eventually the evidence came in and we managed to put health warnings on cigarettes and reduce the levels of smoking and so on. So let's not worry about the delay. But I'm afraid that would be equivalent to saying that it's no big deal that in the interim millions died of lung cancer.
It puts a lot of onus on the shoulders of mathematicians, doesn't it, Jordan, if you're trying to weigh these risks, because it's mathematicians who are the ones who are asked, as you were saying earlier, to quantify the risks and tell us whether which way the balance should go in Rupert's equation.
I mean, the situation as it develops between, let's say, 1950, when this famous British study showing an incredibly elevated rates of lung cancer among smokers in a British hospital, between that time and 1964, when the U.S. Surgeon General really sort of comes out and says, the evidence is in, smoking causes cancer, deal with it. Over those 14 years, a lot of stuff happened. And my concern about the precautionary principle is merely this, that it doesn't give enough credit to the people who worked extremely hard marshalling evidence. That evidence was not valueless. I truly believe that. And I truly believe that the state of our knowledge in 1950 was vastly different from the state of our knowledge in 1964 about tobacco and how it causes cancer. And in some sense, the reason that we knew so much more in 1964 is precisely because people felt that evidence was required. And I'll stand up for that.
But the point is that we shouldn't have to wait for the evidence to come in. We should be able to act when there is still uncertainty. The same applies in various other cases, such as lead in petrol.
But you still accept that it is important not to continue to pursue the search for evidence, even if you say you don't need it in order to act.
Look, I've got absolutely nothing against evidence. Evidence is great. I think our culture is rather too fixated on evidence. And in situations of uncertainty, we should say, well, let's not wait until the evidence comes in. Let's act now.
Okay.
Especially when there's a risk of ruin.
But I don't like this talk of the evidence. Evidence is continuous, not discrete, right? You don't snap from being uncertain to certain. You just improve your knowledge and you improve your understanding, and that can only be good.
Sure, but you never reach certainty, so it's always open to skeptics to say, oh, well, we still need more evidence, we still need more research. The precautionary principle helps to prevent that kind of time wasting.
Thank you very much to all three of you. Now, time for our 60-second idea to improve the world. And this week it comes from the British philosopher and political activist, Rupert Read. And Rupert, you've got just 60 seconds to make your case to me, Bridget Kendall, and my other two guests, American mathematician Jordan Ellenberg and Zambian-born literary scholar and author Namwali Serpell. So, Rupert, if you've collected your thoughts, off you go.
So I think we've become a lot better recently at thinking globally, at taking seriously people who are at a distance from us. But what about people who are at a distance from us in time? So I'm talking about future people, future generations. And I think that in our world today, we're still dreadfully short-termist, not taking nearly serious enough account of the future. So how to deal with this? So I've got a proposal about this. I say, let's bring in a new political institution to sit above any chambers of Parliament and to be empowered and required to manifest concern and care for future people, and indeed to represent their basic interests to us, to represent to us the kind of precaution that I spoke about earlier. How would these people be selected? My proposal, my suggestion is that it's a kind of super jury, a citizens' jury of ordinary people who come together to represent the future. And what power should they have? They should have the power to veto any action that would undermine the basic needs of future people.
Thank you very much, Rupert. I love the notion of trying to make our decisions about the future more democratic by seeking to accommodate the likely needs and wishes of future generations. But of course, that is tricky because they're not around yet. Jordan's already warned us about the uncertainties of making predictions about the future. So my question is, these juries, how would you select them?
So the question is, who's in the best position to represent future people? You might say old people are because they think more about their grandchildren. You might say young people are because they're closer to the future. But really what I think about this is that everybody's equally well-placed and equally poorly placed to represent the future.
So random, actually?
Yeah, random selection, like a jury.
OK, Jordan? Randomness, that's a mathematical concept. What do you think about that?
The challenge here, as I see it, I mean, besides the obvious political challenges, are that people, I think, still, maybe they're better than they were, but we're still pretty bad even at inhabiting the needs and desires of people who live in different countries from us or in different economic situations from us. So imagine how much greater the problems are when we're trying to inhabit the needs, the wants, and the desires of people in the distant future who may not even be people as we understand them, right? They may be cyborgs. They may be artificial intelligences residing in a machine. They may be hyper-evolved dolphins. I mean, who knows who they may be, who we have to be accountable to.
That's the problem, isn't it, Rupert? The future's so uncertain. How do you know what the problems will be and who the people will be?
So I think that the guardians for future generations should only seek to reach to the limits of their knowledge and of the reasonable guesses that they can make. So people 500 million years from now, well, they'll probably have to look after themselves. But I think it's a fairly safe bet that for the near future, people are still going to need habitable ecosystems. They're going to need to eat. They're going to need some form of energy. These are the kinds of things that should be protected against our society's rampant short-termism.
I love having you here. You're both a philosopher and a politician, so you've got a very futuristic abstract view, but very pragmatic as well. Namwali, what do you think? How do you respond to this idea of guardians of future generations?
I think the problem with juries, as the kind of arduous process of jury selection suggests, is not that they know too little about the future, but that they believe that they know more than they do. The kind of bias is not something you could really eliminate, because I don't know, for example, if I will have a bias in 10 years for or against a particular political situation. So I think it would make more sense for this jury to be made up of children, in part because they have very little knowledge of the past and the present, but they have very little knowledge of the future as well. And there's a kind of innocence to this. The problem, of course, is that children often operate in terms of a kind of brute justice, a kind of egalitarianism. So I think it would have to be children because they'd have the most interest in the future, and they would also be less arrogant about what they know about the future, but they would lack this attunement to contingency and to other minds.
I think we've just sketched out the plot of a very scary science fiction story. The idea of children deciding what happens.
I think it's a lovely idea. I really like it.
OK, well, if you're listening and have your own thoughts on Rupert Reed's idea or anything else on the programme, do email us at theforum@bbc.co.uk or contact us via Facebook or Twitter. Now, we've talked about uncertainty in mathematics and in philosophy and in politics, but Namwali, Serpell, your work looks at uncertainty in a different context, its role in modern literary fiction. As you argue in your new book, classic novels may have once instructed us in the good and ethical life, but some modern novels seem to leave us floundering without a moral compass. And you suggest it's not just the content, but the very structure of some modern novels which produces this uncertainty. Can you explain in what ways?
Yes, so my book is called 7 Modes of Uncertainty, and I'm very interested in the way literary form is structured in order to present competing forms of information, competing ideas about an event that happened. And this becomes, of course, very characteristic in modernism, although it is as old as literature itself. In 1993, Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate African-American writer, who wrote her master's thesis on William Faulkner, a Southern American writer who is one of the key figures of literary modernism, discusses the way that the form of the book is itself a kind of argument. She says the structure is the argument, not what this character says or what that character says. It is the structure of the book that presents a kind of argument. And I suggest in my book that a lot of the novels, especially in the second half of the 20th century, all the way up to the present, engage in this structuring of uncertainty, basically forcing it upon any reader that picks it up.
So if you break it down, in what ways does the structure produce this uncertainty?
So I'll just take the example of Toni Morrison and Faulkner, who both deploy a structure that I call multiplicity. This is very familiar to us from, say, a court case where you have a terrible incident, say a murder, and many different witnesses come and offer their testimony as to what they think actually happened. Now, what we know is that very often those accounts conflict with each other, and this produces a certain kind of uncertainty about what really happened. It also produces an uncertainty about what we ought to do, whether or not a particular person should be punished, for example. So Toni Morrison takes up this same structure in her novel Beloved, at the center of which is an intractable, irresolvable ethical problem, which is that a slave woman commits infanticide. She kills her child in order that that child not be taken back into slavery. Morrison uses this structure of multiplicity to make us uncertain about whether Setha's choice to murder her child is the right thing or the wrong thing to do.
Let's have a reading from Beloved, because it's uncertain in more than one ways, isn't it? The narrator in this extract appears to be the character Beloved, but she's very hard to pin down. It's possible she is the child killed by her mother, Setha. Will you read it for us?
Certainly. I am loving my face so much. My dark face is close to me. I want to join, she whispers to me. She whispers. I reach for her. Chewing and swallowing, she touches me. She knows I want to join. She chews and swallows me. I am gone. Now I am her face. My own face has left me. I see me swim away. A hot thing. I see the bottoms of my feet. I am alone. I want to be the two of us. I want the join. I come out of blue water. After the bottoms of my feet swim away from me, I come up. I need to find a place to be. The air is heavy. I am not dead. I am not. There is a house. There is what she whispered to me. I am where she told me. I am not dead. I sit. The sun closes my eyes. When I open them, I see the face I lost. Setha's is the face that left me. Setha sees me see her, and I see the smile. Her smiling face is the place for me. It is the face I lost. She is my face smiling at me. Doing it at last. A hot thing. Now we can join. A hot thing.
Thank you, Namwali. And it is very unsettling, isn't it? Because you get very involved in it, but at the same time you're not quite sure what's going on.
What's happening, exactly. So Beloved is perhaps one of the most mysterious characters in the novel. She is, in a way, the embodiment of Setha's guilt. She seems to be a ghost that basically enters Setha's life in the form of a physical body, a young woman, in fact, who seems to step out of the water and appear at 124 Bluestone Road, the haunted house in which Setha has been living.
I suppose I do wonder, though, whether this is something which is really that new. You know, the idea of a novel where you're not quite sure whether a character is a ghost or is real, or where there are lots of voices. I'm thinking of Dostoevsky's novels. They all have multiple viewpoints, don't they? And that's the middle of the 19th century. What's so modern about this?
the reading I just gave suggests the relationship of Morrison's work to not just modernism, but also to poetry as such. The kind of elliptical gaps that are left between the lines. Even on the page, there are gaps between the sentences I was reading rather than punctuation. So, Morrison is definitely picking up a long legacy of literary uncertainty and techniques for uncertainty. And I don't believe that literary uncertainty in the 20th century is new. What I think is different is the way that we conceive of it. A kind of turn towards seeing literary uncertainty as endemic and as something that is useful for the reader, is actually ethically productive. By the time we get to the 20th century, it's seen as a kind of ethical ideal to make you realize that other people are very various, many of them quite different from you, with different systems of value as well. So this idea that we can use literary uncertainty in order to achieve a certain kind of ethical mode, I think, is what is new.
It's interesting, isn't it, with Toni Morrison, that she is an African-American novelist. And Beloved seems to me, anyway, to be drawing not just on Western literary traditions, but African too. Cultures where you have multiple interweaving worlds, where the real and the spirit worlds coexist, so characters cross over from one to the other. That's very different from the sort of Western Euclidean world view of straight lines and right angles, and the world of the classical Greek philosophers, Rupert, from 2,000 years ago.
Well, yes, but even then I think that the roots of what Namwali is talking about were already present. So take, for example, the dialogues of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote dialogues precisely so that it was uncertain where he himself stood in relation to the issue under discussion, and the reader had to seek to figure out the matter for themselves, which I think is the essence of philosophy. So I think the process that Namwali is talking about in people like Faulkner and Morrison goes back really an awful long way.
I think absolutely. Morrison herself is very influenced by Greek tragedy. She talks about the need for her language to have holes and spaces in it so that the reader can come into it, so that the reader joins in as though part of a community, almost like the chorus in a Greek tragedy. I think when we think about literature's use or affordance for ethical deliberation, we often think of the 19th century novelist Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, where the elaboration of uncertainty, the back and forth, is directed toward a certain kind of clarity, a certain way of seeing better. And I think that there's something slightly different about what contemporary practitioners are doing, because they want to leave us in this kind of very agitated state. They want to emphasize the difficulty of knowing, of ever resolving that uncertainty.
Jordan, what are your thoughts on this?
You opposed these ideas of uncertainty and multiplicity that we see in Morrison's novel to Euclideanism and rationalism, but I don't think those have to be opposed. I actually write about this exact issue in terms of algebra, which is a very difficult subject for many students, and I argue that the reason it's difficult is because in many ways it's a true portrait of a difficult world. So as Namwali says, the difficulty and the uncertainty, those are real. There's a thing that you see, an observation. You see the observation and you say, what gave rise to it? What's behind the veil? And what you learn when you learn algebra, what you have to face is that often it's not determined. Often there's more than one thing that it could be generating the answer that you see. And I think if there's an ethical lesson to algebra, I guess I hope there is, it's that we have to sort of learn to face that and not shy away from it and be cowards, but accept it.
But we don't merely throw up our hands in despair that we do not know or that we cannot know. We continue to try to know. And in those efforts, uncertainty itself becomes productive. It engages us with the world in a way that I would describe as both political in Rupert's terms and ethical.
If that's the case, here we are in a modern world where people in different fields are embracing uncertainty more, where's it heading in your different fields? Jordan, with mathematics, is it going to provide more or less certainty than now in the coming century?
I think mathematical progress is quite simply a matter of becoming more and more confused, but we're confused about different and deeper things, so that's good.
What about philosophy, Rupert?
Well, I think the point is that we live in a world that we will never fully understand. The quest for certainty is hubristic. It's a quest for domination. It's not going to succeed. The question is whether we have the willpower to learn to live with uncertainty and for it to empower us rather than to disable or paralyse us.
And that's interesting, Namwali, when it comes to literature, because if we are aware that we live in this very uncertain world, it could be the case that in literature people will seek more certainty to reassure themselves.
One of the trends that I've noticed in literary uncertainty in the 21st century is that it's quite often tamed. It's almost a domesticated uncertainty. It's almost a kind of sentimentality. There's a lot of novels revolving around 9/11 that fall into this trap, I think. And I think the most important thing to me as a critic and as a writer is to keep agitating, is to keep us having these doubts as we move forward.
Well, my thanks to all three of you, Jordan Ellenberg, Rupert Reed and Namwali Serpell. Next week, natural navigation. How do migratory birds or butterflies find their way? And for that matter, how does our brain know where things are in space? Till then, from me, Bridget Kendall, and all of us here at the Forum, have a good week. And for our usual bird song to end with, we bring you the sounds of birds, including a heron and a white-faced whistling duck, in the riverine forest by the Luangwa River in northern Zambia.
If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try others, such as In Our Time, where Melvyn Bragg discusses the history of ideas. To find out more, visit bbc.com/podcast.